what are the best visa options for Canadians looking to move to the US? In this video, I'm going to cover the most commonly used visas by Canadians and their advantages and disadvantages to help shed some clarity on what options you have if you're a Canadian watching this video. First and foremost, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for watching. I'm attorney Adrian Pandev, and I try to make the US government maze a bit easier for foreigners who are looking to move or invest in the US. This particular video is very close to my heart because I did in fact move from Canada to the US. I grew up outside Toronto, so I've had many of the visas that I'm going to be discussing in this video. So unlike some of the other videos I have recorded where I'm explaining certain processes, this one's actually very close to my heart because I've lived through it myself. Now, so first and foremost, let's talk about the TN visa because it's a very commonly used visa for Canadians. It's very unique in the sense that only Mexican and Canadian citizens are eligible for it because it's created by the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is NAFTA, now USMCA. But basically, to qualify for a TN visa, you have to be a Canadian citizen. So the one question I get from Canadian permanent residents often is, can I qualify for a TN? No, only if you have a Canadian passport, only if you are a Canadian citizen. Now, the second requirement besides the Canadian citizenship is you need a US job offer. So a US employer, company, organization needs to give you a job offer. The TN is not a good visa to start a business in the US. I'll cover that in a second. But the bottom line is you also need a job offer to qualify for it. And then third and absolutely critical, only certain occupations can qualify for a TN. So there's like an occupation list of TN professions that can qualify. So you have to be in one of those occupations. If you're not, in those fields, then the TN will unfortunately not work for you. Now, another very critical part of the TN visa is that generally your degree that you received has to match that occupation. So just to illustrate this with an example, right? If you're entering as an accountant, accountants are one of the designated TN fields. If you're entering as an accountant on a TN, you will have to demonstrate a degree in accounting in order to be eligible for that TN visa. Now, sometimes the degrees aren't an exact match, and then you can argue that your degree is related, right? So say you don't have I'm just going to make this up, a bachelor's degree in accounting to follow that example. That is not necessarily the end of the world as long as the bachelor's degree that you do have matches or is very similar to an accounting degree, and you can demonstrate that to US Customs, who will adjudicate that TN visa. Now, as long as you meet all these requirements, what are the biggest advantages of the TN visa? Well, number one, it's frankly expedited processing at the border, right? You apply at a US border checkpoint. This can be at an airport, so often in Canada, right? Pre-clearance, you go through customs in Canada, so you do it at the airport in Canada, or at a customs border checkpoint driving into the US, that works too. But the bottom line is you do it right there on the spot at the border, and the decision is rendered right there. So it's an expedited process, which is much better than many of the other visas where you wait, weeks and months in order to hear back from the government. The second big advantage is that it's a 3-year work visa that you can renew indefinitely. So you could be in the US for many, many years on a TN visa without any major, without running out of time, like with the H-1B, which I'll talk about in a second. So that's another big advantage. The disadvantages, well, frankly, I already went through some of them. The fact that not everybody can apply for it. So if you don't have if your field is not one of the ones that's on the occupation list, it's not going to work. Also, spouses of TNs cannot work, so that's also a major disadvantage. And then finally, it's very limiting, where you can only work for this one employer in the US, so your visa is very much dependent on the employer, and it does not allow self-employment really. So these are the biggest disadvantages. Now let's move on. The next visa category I want to talk about is the let's just call them E visas, E1 and E2 visas. These are, unlike the TN, are great for individuals who want to be self-employed in the US, who want to start a business or maybe have already started a business. So let me just go through them very quickly. So the E2 visa is it's called a treaty investor visa, and then the E1 visa is a treaty trader visa. And the treaty just means that the US and Canada have the requisite treaty that allows this visa to exist. There's basically a treaty of commerce that allows the visa to actually exist in and allows you to apply for it, basically. Now, treaty investor generally means you need to make a substantial investment in the US. So you basically start a company in the US, you invest capital, you invest cash to build that company out, and you qualify as the investor who's going to move to the US to direct this business inside the US. The treaty trader is a bit different. It looks more at trade between Canada and the US. So it's more about the volume of whether it's goods or services moving back and forth between Canada and the US. I feel that the E1 treaty trader visa is very underutilized compared to the E2, even though very many Canadian businesses sell into the US, whether it's services or goods, and they're both very viable options, right? Generally speaking, how do I differentiate between them? Well, if you're engaging in trade with the US, whether you're already selling services into the US or goods into the US and trading back and forth between the two countries, the E1's a great option. If you're not doing that and you're just looking to start a business in the US and there's not going to be much cross-border movement of goods or services, well then the E2 is the better option. Now, the biggest advantage of the E-visas is that first and foremost for Canadians, it's a 5-year visa, so it's a very long-term visa. Just like the TN, you can renew it indefinitely, so you could live on it for many, many years in the US. So it's not, there's no expiration like with the H-1B where there's a maximum of 6 years. Another massive advantage is that unlike in the TN scenario, the spouse of the E-visa holder receives employment authorization in the US, and it's free employment authorization. So what that means is it's not linked to a specific employer. You can work anywhere in the US. So often there's a lot of good strategic planning about who becomes the primary principal applicant and who is the spouse, because the spouse actually gets a lot more flexibility when it comes to working in the US versus the principal applicant who can only work for the organization that is petitioning the visa. And unlike the TN, the E-visa also allows you to work for yourself. So you could be 100% owner of the company. So there's two options. Unlike in the TN scenario, you have the one that's similar to the TN where you have a US employer file the application on your behalf when you're coming to work for an employer in the US, or you have the alternative where you start your own company or maybe already have a company that you're expanding into the US or where you're going to expand US operations, and that's allowed under the E-visa. What are the biggest disadvantages? Well, number one, you have to have the relevant again, treaty nationality, right? So if you're not a Canadian citizen, well, then this may not be an option for you. So again, Canadian permanent residence, it may not work, right? It just depends on what passport you have. But if you're a Canadian citizen, that's not an issue because the treaty is between Canada and the US. The other disadvantage of the E category, if you're not being brought in by an employer, is that you do have to demonstrate substantial investment, substantial trade, right? So if you're making an investment, well, you're going to have to spend capital, right, that you must have. It's not always easy. It depends on your financial means. Similarly with trade, just because you've had a couple US clients, that doesn't mean that it's substantial and you're already at the level where you can apply. So it does require a significant commitment, financial or work-related commitment on the trade side. If you're looking to do it through employment, the biggest disadvantage is that the only way a US employer can sponsor you to be on a E-visa is that the employer itself has to be considered a treaty enterprise. And what that means is that the majority of the ownership of the US organization, of the US company, has to be also Canadian owned. That's extremely limiting. So if you're just applying for jobs in the US, don't want to start your own company in the US, it's going to be hard to find that employer because you're essentially only looking for Canadian companies with US subsidiaries or affiliates. So to summarize the E1, E2 visas, I think they're best, or maybe not best, but better suited for individuals looking to work for themselves. Because if you're looking to work for an employer, especially if you fall into one of the occupation lists, the TN may be a better option. Now, let's move on to the H-1B. H-1B is the most commonly used visa for foreign professionals. It's a specialized knowledge visa. Unlike the TN, there's no specific list, but generally speaking, the occupations that qualify for an H-1B require at least a bachelor's degree in order to qualify for an H-1B visa and for the position. Now, the H-1B is a different process to the TN and the E-visa because you file initially a petition with USCIS, and only after it's approved are you allowed to enter an H-1B status. Now, the biggest advantage of the H-1B is that it's the most commonly used visa by U.S. companies and organizations for anyone with specialized knowledge. So there's a very well worked out system by most employers on how to use it. The biggest disadvantage is probably the lottery. There's an H-1B lottery every year. There's only a finite amount of H-1B visas available, and there's way more applicants than available visas, unfortunately. So let's call it a 12 to 15% chance of selection, and you already have to have secured the employer in order to be enrolled in this H-1B lottery. Now, I want to highlight certain employers are not subject to this lottery. Well, they're nonprofits that are affiliated with universities and other institutes of higher education, or they're actually universities or other colleges that themselves petition for H-1B. So not everyone is subject to this lottery, but this is the biggest disadvantage for the H-1B, that everyone else has to not only secure a job or an offer, I should say, an offer from a U.S. employer. In addition, they also have to go through this lottery. If you do go through the lottery and your position qualifies as a specialty occupation position, then the process is fairly straightforward and routine, where you file a petition with USCIS. Once that's approved, you take your approval notice to a U.S. Customs Border checkpoint, and you will be admitted as a Canadian citizen in H-1B status. The H-1B can be approved for 3 years, a maximum of 3 years, and you can extend it one time for an additional 3 years. So you get a maximum of 6 years. This is a big difference to the E and TN visas, where you can renew indefinitely. If I'm making it sound like the H-1B has no benefits compared to the other two, that's not true at all, because first and foremost, you may not be eligible for a TN because you're not on the occupation list, but you may still be in a specialty occupation where you qualify for an H-1B. The other big advantage of the H-1B visa is that it's called what's called dual intent, and what that means is that unlike the E and TN visas, where it's a temporary visa where your intent should be to come to the US, work here temporarily, and leave, the H-1B allows for dual intent. So you can intend to come here, work, and leave, or you can intend to stay long-term and apply for permanent residence. Now, there's a lot of technicalities of why that's important, but the bottom line is, if your goal is US permanent residence, the H-1B visa can be a very good step in that direction because it has this dual intent ability. Very many TN visa holders switch to H-1B before they become permanent resident. I'm a perfect example of that because that was my journey to the US. Now let's talk about the O1 visa. The O1 visa is for individuals of extraordinary ability. The beauty of it is that it doesn't matter what field you're in, what profession, you could qualify for an O1 as long as you can demonstrate that you are at the top of your field, that you're someone with extraordinary talent. So it's very, very often used by actors, musicians, by athletes, but also, startup founders, also scientists, etc. So you're not limited to only the artistic fields, call it. You could also work in business or in tech or whatever else and qualify for an O1 visa. The focus isn't so much on your degrees in your field. The focus is much more on how you rank compared to your peers in your field and whether you should be awarded this extraordinary ability visa. I see very many Canadians, especially actors, athletes, also company founders, use the O1. The beauty of it is that similarly to the other visas that we've discussed, like the TN or the E, it can be renewed indefinitely. It's generally issued for up to 3 years initially, but you are able to renew it thereafter. So it gives that flexibility similar to those visas. It is a very useful tool for those, especially in the fields like the arts or music or anything like that, where all the professional visas are not available. Like the TN, its biggest disadvantage is that spouses cannot work, unfortunately. And I should have said this about the H-1B too. The H-1B also does not allow spouses to work. So in this regard, it has that same limitation, but it provides the amazing flexibility that you're not so limited to those occupations like with the TN. So the final visa I want to talk about is the L1. It's an intra-company transfer visa. And what that means is basically that the L1 allows companies to move staff, employees across their various operations globally. Now, you may be asking, well, why would I do an L1 visa and just, not the TN if I'm being moved from a Canadian office to the American office? Well, what happens is if individuals don't qualify for a TN because their specific job is not on the occupation list, and they don't qualify for the H-1B, say they miss out on the lottery, and the company is not majority Canadian owned, so the E-visas are out, that's when the L visa comes into play very often. So the idea with the L visa is that the company is able to transfer personnel from one office to the other within its global operation. So there's two types of L1s. You should notice one is a L1 manager, the other one's an L1 specialized knowledge employee. The bottom line is to differentiate between the two. If you worked in a managerial capacity, executive capacity abroad, or being moved to the US to continue to be a manager, then the L1A, the L1 manager, will come into play. If you worked on something more specific projects, right, more proprietary, but you weren't really managing individuals or projects, you were more just working in a very specialized capacity, say working on some engineering work on proprietary systems, etc., that is when the L1B comes in, and that's how a lot of engineers from Canada get transferred to the US, for example. Both of them, so they have limitations. The L1 visa has limitations for both L1As and L1Bs like the H1B. So there's a maximum of 7 years for an L1A managers and a maximum of 5 years for L1B specialized knowledge positions. The initial visa can be issued for a maximum of 3 years, and then you can renew it in 2-year intervals. The L1 can also be used like the E-visa for self-employment, so you can in fact own your own business. To be honest, for most Canadian citizens, I find that the E2 or the E1 makes a lot more sense, simply because it's a visa that provides more flexibility. You don't have the limitations on these renewals. It's less steps. Also, similar to the E-visa, L1 spouses, called L2s, receive employment authorization, just like with the E. So this is a big advantage compared to the TN, H1B, and O1, where spouses cannot work. L1 spouses, called L2s, can in fact work. So to summarize the L1, I see this most commonly used when someone is being transferred from a Canadian operation to the US operation of a company, and they don't qualify for the TN or E-visas, or H1B, I should say. And these are really your main options. You may be saying, hey, these are all the same that, I've already researched. Yes, the only one that's only available to Canadians and Mexicans is the TN. But I hope this video at least helped clear up a little bit how certain visa categories can apply to Canadians specifically, and what the advantages or disadvantages about them are. If you liked the video, please hit the like button and follow. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments, and I'll try to record more videos that are hopefully helpful. Thank you for watching.